welcome to the debate. Usually, when a massive structure collapses, like a skyscraper or a bridge, we look at the rubble and just assume everything inside was crushed. You really don't expect to find anything untouched in the debris.
Right, the structural failure is total. The foundation gives way, and, well, the assumption is that there is no surviving the fallout.
Exactly. But imagine walking through the dust and wreckage of a completely leveled building and finding a single, perfectly constructed, highly advanced vault just sitting there. Not only did it survive the collapse, but it seems to have been actively drawing power from the destruction around it.
That is the kind of anomaly that forces you to question the laws of physics. You have to ask whether that survival was a miracle of organic design or if it was just built with elite, reinforced materials that absolutely nobody else in the building had access to.
In 2006, the global music industry was that collapsing building. We're talking about an era of structural freefall. I mean, the transition from analog to digital had initiated a devastating existential recession for the major labels.
Yeah, we witnessed the death of the compact disc, the mass liquidations of cultural institutions like Tower Records across the US, and of course, the silent, distant dawn of a Swedish startup called Spotify that was about to change the paradigm forever.
The traditional infrastructure was practically burning to the ground. And in Nashville, the epicenter of country music, the industry gatekeepers were terrified.
Absolutely terrified. The executives, the radio programmers, they were clinging to deeply conservative, risk-averse formulas just to keep the lights on. The barrier to entry for an unknown artist, let alone an underrepresented demographic like a teenage girl, was statistically insurmountable.
Exactly. And into this apocalyptic industry landscape steps a 16-year-old girl with a self-titled debut album, Taylor Swift. The central question we are exploring today is whether the monumental, paradigm-shifting success of this 2006 album was the result of an undeniable, organic artistic genius that shattered Nashville's gatekeepers on its own merit.
Or if it was a ruthlessly calculated, corporate-level product funded by generational wealth and engineered for survival.
Right. I will argue that this album's triumph was driven by a generational artistic vision and an authentic emotional resonance that no amount of corporate machinery could ever fake.
And I will demonstrate that her so-called authentic success was actually a masterclass in industrial mechanics, bought with structural financial leverage and managed with, a Fortune 500 level ruthlessness.
Let's begin by looking at her actual entry into the industry, because the prevailing, somewhat lazy narrative of the manufactured pop star completely shatters when you examine a young Taylor Swift's defiant artistic autonomy. When she was just 15, she was offered what was essentially the holy grail for any aspiring artist, an artist development deal with RCA Records.
A deal which famously she walked away from.
Exactly. She rejected a major label because she understood with staggering clarity how those development deals actually function. They intended to warehouse her.
Sure.
They wanted to mold her into a predictable market product, holding her music hostage until they felt she fit their formula. This wasn't a manufactured idol. This was a prodigious talent who became Sony ATV's youngest signed songwriter at 14. She walked into the Bluebird Cafe in Nashville, played original compositions, songs she wrote entirely by herself without a committee of older men, and demanded to be heard on her own terms. That is the very definition of artistic sovereignty.
I hear that romantic narrative. I truly do. It sounds phenomenal.
Because it is.
But it conveniently omits the immense financial scaffolding that made such defiance possible. Her artistic autonomy was entirely subsidized by extraordinary generational wealth. If we actually look at the cap table, her father, Scott Swift, wasn't just a supportive parent passing out demo tapes from the trunk of a sedan.
Well, he was supportive.
He was a Merrill Lynch banker, a descendant of 3 generations of bank presidents, and he purchased a 3% equity stake in the newly formed Big Machine Records for roughly $120,000.
Which was seed money for a very risky startup label.
But look at the leverage Abbott. When you inject $120,000 into an independent label that, at the time, had a grand total of 12 employees, you aren't just being a supportive father, you are buying structural leverage.
I think that's a cynical read of...
You have to understand how that changes the power dynamic in a room. She wasn't an expendable, powerless employee trapped in a development deal who bravely broke free. She was practically a joint venture partner from day one. It is remarkably easy to be artistically sovereign and walk away from RCA when your family essentially holds board-level influence in your new kingdom.
You are confusing the soil with the seed. Yes, her family had leverage, but the critical question is what she actually did with it. She used that leverage to protect a highly specific artistic vision that the industry didn't understand yet.
A vision heavily managed by her team.
No. When it came time to record the album, Big Machine's executives, including the label head Scott Borchetta, wanted seasoned Nashville producers. They wanted the safe bet.
Naturally, they needed a return on investment.
But she demanded Nathan Chapman. Chapman was a 36-year-old unknown demo producer who had never produced a commercially released full album in his life. Let me explain what a demo producer is. Their job is to make cheap, fast, rough recordings of songs so songwriters can pitch them to the real stars. They aren't the guys who make the final album.
Right.
Chapman had the right chemistry. And the result of that defiance was a brilliant hybrid sound architecture. She intuitively blended traditional country instrumentation, banjos, fiddles, a southern drawl, with distorted electric pop rock guitars. She blueprinted the pop country crossover that defined the next decade. You cannot buy that kind of sonic foresight, no matter how much equity your father holds.
I see why you frame it as sonic foresight. But let's look at the actual power mechanics of choosing a producer. When you are a 15-year-old artist trying to maintain absolute creative control, working with an unknown demo producer isn't just about chemistry.
What else is it about?
It's a calculated power play. Chapman had no ego, no legacy to protect, and zero institutional weight to throw around in the studio. If she had worked with a legendary Nashville producer, they would have dictated the sessions. Choosing Chapman allowed her to retain total executive authority over her sound.
I don't see how retaining executive authority over your own art is a negative.
It's not a negative, but it's a structural calculation, not just artistic magic. And frankly, we shouldn't romanticize the recording studio while ignoring the terrifyingly strict corporate-style risk management apparatus operating just outside the booth, led, of course, by her mother, Andrea Swift.
I really wouldn't call a mother protecting her teenage daughter in a notoriously predatory industry terrifyingly strict.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it was merely maternal protection. The industry literally referred to her as Central Intelligence Andrea. Andrea Swift wasn't just managing a teenager. She was executing worst-case scenario management on a corporate scale.
She was keeping her safe.
She conducted rigorous background checks on anyone interacting with her daughter. And there is the chilling historical detail of Andrea restricting a 13-year-old Taylor from eating fast food like Taco Bell because, and I quote, "No one wants to buy CDs from a fat pop star."
Which is a heartbreaking reality of the early 2000s music industry, not necessarily a reflection of Andrea's malice.
Malice isn't the point, optimization is. That is intense psychological enmeshment. It is treating a human being as a brand asset that must be shielded from any potential PR liability. So I have to ask, isn't this flawless public brand merely the result of elite crisis management and psychological policing rather than some natural, authentic teen grace?
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it completely differently. The music industry destroys young women. We have decades of evidence, Britney, Christina, of teen sensations completely collapsing under the weight of fame and public scrutiny. Andrea's intense oversight was a necessary shield in a highly toxic environment.
A shield that also functioned as a branding iron.
But more importantly, beneath that shield, the art itself remained untainted and overwhelmingly authentic. If this was all just a ruthlessly calculated product, the music would feel sterile. It would sound like it was written by a committee of marketers trying to guess what teenagers care about.
And you're arguing it doesn't.
I'm arguing it is the exact opposite. Look at the anatomical structure of the songwriting on this album. Take our song. She wrote that in 20 minutes for a ninth grade talent show.
or Teardrops on My Guitar, where she literally names a real classmate, Drew Hardwick, who didn't notice her.
Ah, yes. The diary approach.
She didn't write about Hollywood glamour or clubbing or manufactured pop tropes. She took the rich storytelling traditions of country music and applied them to the granular, unvarnished reality of being a high school freshman. She wrote about eating disorders in Tied Together with a Smile. She treated her discography like an open diary. That raw honesty created a genuine connection with millennials that no marketing department could ever contrive.
An open diary. That's an elegant way to describe a Trojan horse.
Wait, a Trojan horse?
Absolutely. You frame her songwriting as spontaneous, naive diary entries. But let's look at her lead single, Tim McGraw. You think it's just a heartfelt tribute?
It is a narrative song about a memory.
Country music in 2006 was practically a gated community. You couldn't just walk in as a 16-year-old girl. Tim McGraw was a brilliantly reverse-engineered marketing tactic. She and her co-writer, Liz Rose, explicitly designed that track to trick traditional, highly conservative country radio programmers into playing her song.
Trick them by writing about a song by Tim McGraw?
By weaponizing his brand. By putting a beloved country legend's name in the title and the chorus, they created a mandatory listening experience for the gatekeepers. It was the equivalent of SEO keyword stuffing for radio DJs. If a DJ sees Tim McGraw on a track list, they have to press play just out of professional obligation.
That's incredibly cynical.
It's mechanical. It wasn't about Tim McGraw, it was about leveraging the familiarity of Tim McGraw that bypassed the industry's immune system. It was algorithmic keyword optimization before the algorithm even existed.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the song's emotional core. Tim McGraw isn't a cynical keyword drop. It is a profoundly mature song about the associative power of music. It's about a summer romance ending because the boy is going off to college, and the visceral memory triggered by a shared song. The fact that the song happened to be by Tim McGraw was authentic to her experience as a country fan in the mid-2000s.
But you cannot deny the mechanical utility of the title.
I don't deny the utility, but utility doesn't sustain a career. If it lacked emotional truth, radio programmers might have played it once for the novelty, but listeners wouldn't have kept requesting it. The same goes for the track Picture to Burn, where she channels this furious Southern rock angstic energy against a narcissistic ex-boyfriend. It's raw, it's messy, it's real teenage anger.
Real teenage anger that was rapidly sanitized by the machine.
Sanitized how?
Let's talk about Picture to Burn. The original lyrics featured a line where she threatened to tell her friends the ex-boyfriend was gay. In later pressings and radio edits, the team rapidly altered the lyric to, "You won't mind if I say." Why? Because the corporate apparatus recognized the shifting political correctness of the era and neutralized a brand liability in real time. They were constantly fine-tuning the product. You mistake a flawlessly executed brand adjustment for raw authenticity.
Adapting to cultural norms doesn't erase the authenticity of the emotion. But if we want to talk about how she reached those listeners and proved her authenticity, we have to look at MySpace. Because while the major labels were treating the internet like a sterile billboard, she was personally coding her own MySpace page.
Wait, you consider her MySpace presence a purely grassroots phenomenon?
Absolutely, because the evidence demands it. She was using it as a personal blog, updating fans on her high school life, answering messages directly, building a real community. It wasn't mediated by a corporate strategy. She literally had to send HTML code to her web developer to get it uploaded. She established a direct parasocial relationship with her fans before we even had a word for it.
A relationship that yielded incredible data.
She bypassed the out-of-touch Nashville executives entirely, proving she understood the digital transition of the music industry better than the CEOs did.
You praise her digital genius on MySpace, but her true capitalist masterstroke was figuring out how to weaponize that platform as a data extraction tool. MySpace wasn't just a diary for her to commune with fans. It was an early form of consumer data analytics.
How so?
In 2006, we didn't have Spotify analytics dashboards.
Exactly, which makes what they did even more brilliant. Big Machine Records explicitly monitored the engagement metrics and repeat listen data on her embedded MySpace Flash player. They used that highly specific geographic and demographic data to justify to terrestrial radio promoters why our song should be pushed as a single.
They were just paying attention to their audience.
They were extracting behavioral data to mitigate risk. Furthermore, the illusion of this organic, grassroots internet phenomenon is completely shattered when you look at the grueling, highly calculated physical B2B radio tour she undertook.
Her radio tours were the definition of authentic labor. She spent 6 months in a rental car driving across the country, playing acoustic guitar for program directors, bringing them donuts and building relationships face to face. That is paying your dues.
I suppose handing out donuts hits a bit differently when your indie label is backed by Merrill Lynch money. But look at the architecture of how those tours were structured. Her manager at the time, Rick Barker, deliberately booked her into the Buffalo Club in Boise, Idaho. The Buffalo Club is a strictly 21 and over venue. He had a teenager play an acoustic set for over an hour to an adult audience before her single even hit the airwaves.
Which is incredibly brave for a teenager.
It's not just brave, it's a strategic narrative. Why Boise? Why a 21 and over club? Because it was a deliberate proof of concept maneuver to prove to adult stakeholders, corporate sponsors, and media buyers that she wasn't just a teeny bopper act. That is pure, calculated, business-to-business marketing logic disguised as an organic live gig. And it didn't stop there. They blanketed television, GAC shortcuts documentaries, Good Morning America. They were building an omni-channel marketing assault to sell the prodigy narrative.
Now, listeners might be hearing all this and thinking, sure, her dad had money and her team had a great marketing strategy. Lots of artists have that. But the calculation you're describing only works if the artist actually delivers the performance.
Well, execution is part of the machinery.
You can put a mediocre manufactured pop star in a 21 and over club in Boise, Idaho, and they will get booed off the stage in 10 minutes. She had to sit there with a single acoustic guitar and command a room of adults for an hour and 15 minutes. The marketing strategy merely created the opportunity. Her undeniable artistic gravity is what closed the deal. She commanded the stage because she felt the music.
She commanded the stage because she understood the visual economy of television and live performance, which brings us perfectly to how she understood the physical economy of her media. You praise her digital community building, but we have to look at how she forced those digital fans back into the physical world. Let's look at the CD booklet itself.
The liner notes are actually a prime example of her artistic community building. She capitalized specific letters in the lyric booklets to spell out hidden messages. For Teardrops on My Guitar, it spelled, He Will Never Know. For Should Have Said No, it spelled out Sam, 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 explicitly naming the boy who cheated on her.
Oh yes, the famous Easter eggs.
It was a private language shared exclusively with her fans. It's a deeply artistic, intimate way to reward people for caring about the physical album. It fostered a community that actively deciphered her work together.
I admire the idealism, but that is a remarkably naive reading of basic behavioral economics. Those Easter eggs were not a private artistic language. They were pure gamification. We already established the music industry was collapsing in 2006. Digital piracy, specifically LimeWire, was decimating physical sales. How do you convince a teenager to spend $15 on a physical CD when they can rip the MP3s for free?
By creating a great album.
No, by adding exclusive value to the physical media. You tap into human psychology. You practically force them to buy the physical booklet to decode the capitalized letters. It triggers the sunk cost fallacy and variable reward systems. It was a ruthlessly effective scheme to incentivize physical sales in a dying medium.
It wasn't a scheme.
It shifted the act of buying a CD from a mere transaction into an initiation ritual into a community. It masked consumer manipulation as intimacy, generating a feedback loop of brand loyalty that locked consumers into her ecosystem.
Calling it consumer manipulation ignores the psychological value it provided to the listener. It wasn't a trick. It was a fair exchange. Yes, it incentivized physical sales, but it also built a profound sense of loyalty. The fans felt seen. They felt like they were part of an inside joke, a shared universe.
A very profitable universe.
That level of dedication doesn't come from feeling manipulated. It comes from feeling valued. Pitchfork and Rolling Stone, who, by the way, retroactively ranked this album as one of the 100 best debut albums of all time, didn't praise this record because the CD booklet was gamified. They praised it because the music authentically captured the teenage experience.
They praised it retrospectively because the machine successfully sustained the artist long enough for the culture to reevaluate her. If she had sold 40,000 copies and faded into obscurity, Pitchfork wouldn't have written a word about her.
But she didn't fade into obscurity, and that is where I must synthesize my position. I am not denying that the structural scaffolding around Taylor Swift was elite. I am not denying the $120,000 equity stake or the brilliant extraction of data on MySpace or the genius of the B2B marketing strategy in Boise. But capital and strategy alone can't buy 275 weeks on the Billboard 200.
They certainly give you a head start.
You cannot reverse engineer a cultural phenomenon that endures for a quarter of a century. The marketing, the leverage, the strategy, these were just the vehicle. The engine was an inescapable emotional gravity, a hybrid sonic architecture, and an unprecedented songwriting talent that articulated the complexities of youth better than anyone else of her generation.
And I maintain that without that heavily armored vehicle, the engine would have stalled on the side of the road and rusted. Without the structural equity leverage of that initial 2005 contract, without the intense psychological policing and risk management by her mother, without the reverse-engineered Trojan horse of Tim McGraw, and without the behavioral economics of the CD booklet, her raw talent would have been swallowed whole by the collapsing 2006 music industry. She survived the apocalypse not just because she was a good songwriter, but because the industrial machine built around her was absolutely flawless.
It seems we are at a philosophical impasse. The truth is inextricably entangled. The art and the machine are so tightly woven together in the DNA of this 2006 debut that trying to isolate one from the other might be fundamentally impossible.
Indeed. And understanding this precise tension, the 2005 contract structure, the equity leverage, the control of the master recordings, is absolutely essential because it is the exact same structural mechanics that led to the massive corporate war over her catalog in the 2020s.
The Ithaca Holdings buyout.
Exactly. The Hype Corporation acquisition, and the subsequent birth of Taylor's version. The very machine her family helped build and weaponize eventually grew large enough to try and consume her, forcing her to rewrite the rules of intellectual property all over again.
Which brings us back to that single, perfectly constructed vault sitting in the rubble of a collapsed building. We know it survived. We know it went on to reshape the skyline of the entire city. But we leave you, the listener, to decide. Was the sophisticated machinery merely built to protect a priceless work of art? Or was the art merely the fuel required to power the ultimate machine?